Okay. As everyone else, I'm very glad to be here and excited about a conference that seems to be so keenly related to my research. So here I go. In 1910, the Manifesto of Futurist painters proclaimed, "Living art draws its life from the surrounding environment." In this paper, I'll argue that Italian Futurism, and I'm focusing on the Futurist artist and Marinetti in the first decade of the movement, was more immediately concerned with the present than with the future. In the first part, I'll highlight the dominance of the present in their theory and practice, and in the second, I'll argue that their present was one of ambiguous relationships with time, which allow Futurism's own complex temporality. In the passage following the quote I just gave, the Futurists say that they should paint modes of transport and the frenetic experience of modern life, which is exactly what they do. They paint Milan, or in Gino Taffarini's case, Paris. This is Carrà. So they paint trams and trains and cars, seen here with Carrà and with Russolo. They paint workers, as seen in Balla, anarchists, seen again in Carrà. They paint theatregoers, Carrà again, and dancers here in the work of Severini, and the city itself, as seen in the work of Umberto Boccioni. It must be remembered that in the 1910s, Italy had a particularly varied position with regards to modernisation, as apart from the industrial triangle of Milan, Genoa and Turin, and the capital Rome, it was still a largely agricultural peninsula. For example, in Boccioni's The City Rises, seen here, the construction scene is dominated not by a machine, but by a workhorse. Balla, when he was interested in capturing ideas of speed, he was looking at as much at swallows as he was motor cars, and he also showed an interest in astronomy, and all of these things were simultaneously present in what Boccioni repeatedly referred to as our time. I want to stress that the assertion that Futurism is a form of Presentism has previously been noted, not least by Sacha Brou, who gave a fabulous paper on modernism and the now a few years ago, and also François Hartog, who's interested in Presentism as a regime of historicity in the early 20th century, who also has looked at this idea that Futurism's subjects were things found in the present, and he went as far as saying that Marinetti's Futurism is pretty much a Presentism. Hartog also suggests that Marinetti's present was futurized, and I'd like to turn now to look at Marinetti's writings to discuss the Futurist relationship between present and future. The Futurists, and particularly Marinetti, did not attempt to predict beyond the decade they delineated as their time of action. In the founding manifesto, Marinetti demanded that they be thrown into the wastebasket after 10 years. And in 1915 he wrote, "We are the Futurists of tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow." So he's clearly not worried about the long term. Marinetti's Electrical War, a Futurist vision hypothesis, from war the world's only hygiene, is the text most interested in what the future would actually be like, but it's written very much in the language of its present. Marinetti may, and I quote here, "envy the men who will be born on my beautiful peninsula in 100 years, who live behind walls of iron and glass, write in books of nickel no thicker than 3 centimetres, containing 100,000 pages, and use wireless telephones," a description which obviously resonates quite strongly with contemporary architecture, computing and telecommunications. But the vision hypothesis is dominated by the machines of Marinetti's present, by motor cars, trains and planes. He describes steel elephants, which is a lot less alien to his present than, for example, the world of Eloy and Morlocks that the time traveller encounters in H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, which, by this point, Marinetti would have in all likelihood been familiar with. Wells and also Jules Verne were very influential on Italian science fiction of sort of slightly before Futurism, by authors such as Paolo Mantegazza and Emilio Salgari. And Darwinism too had had a mixed reception in a strongly Catholic country, but had certainly been picked up. Wells's vision of the future in The Time Machine counters a Darwinian faith in progress, as humanity has not necessarily evolved for the better. It's a dystopian vision of where Wells's present was heading. Marinetti, on the other hand, is far more optimistic. In the founding manifesto, he says, the past is necessarily inferior to the future. And in Electrical War, he says, all your hope should be in the future. In the same text, Marinetti stresses that the futurists are evolved beings compared to their grandfathers. He says, we breathe an atmosphere that to them would have seemed unbreathable. Similar evolutionary phrases can be found elsewhere in War, the World's Only Hygiene. In Multiplied Man and the Reign of the Machine, Marinetti speaks of humans evolving to have wings and fly, changing the function of the heart, and never knowing old age or impotence. Marinetti's blind faith in the future may seem passive, but I argue that futurism's role was to act in the present to secure Italy's place in the future. Marinetti says on the eve of the First World War, or Italy's entry into the First World War, on the eve of this fearful conflict, we Italian futurists have no desire to see Italy left in an inferior state. This is why we cast overboard the heavy burden of the past that weighs down our swift and warlike vessel. Now, I find it useful at this juncture to consider the difference between il futuro and l'avvenire, obviously a distinction not present in the English language, turning to Derrida, who distinguished between le futur as the predictable future that's expected and l'avenir as the unpredictable future that's not expected. I'd like to consider this difference in the light of a distinction made by Wells again in 1902 in his lecture The Discovery of the Future, in which he differentiated those who attack the established order in the present from those who submissively accept the future. Wells saw people in the modern age as less concerned with tradition and accepting the future. Instead, they were actively looking to shape it. So mapping these two kind of Wells and Derrida together, a futurist would act in the present to change the future, whereas an avenirist would accept what was ahead and incorporate this into their present practice. As such, the fact that Marinetti very actively chose futurism suggests that he was concerned with this acting in the present rather than awaiting the developments of the future. Even though this can be ideologically supported in the way I've just suggested, it must be remembered that the choice of futurism was probably also a pragmatic choice, in that avvenire and avvenirismo had also been used in a number of other contexts in post-Risorgimento Italy. And indeed, some peripheral affiliates of futurism, Arnaldo Ginna and Bruno Corrà, also wrote manifestos in 1910 and 1915 discussing the art of the avvenire. Notably, their manifestos were far more concerned with science and involving it in art than the main futurist artists, whose early manifestos were more concerned with ending passéism in Italian art. So far, I've argued that futurism is predominantly concerned with the present, but a futurised present. My main research, as such as said, is more about futurism's relationship with the past, and this is for me, the other side of the same coin. While admiring a futurised present, futurism repudiates a passatista present. For the rest of this paper, I want to argue that this model of the present, which can involve the past and the future, is made possible by the ambiguous temporality of futurism's own present. Marinetti's statement in The Founding Manifesto that time and space died yesterday suggests not only that the futurists were aware of changing ideas about time, with the introduction of world standard time at one extreme and Bergsonian experiential time at the other, but he considered temporal ambiguities relevant to the identity of the futurist movement. The futurist obsession with speed was central to their interest in a sort of Newtonian, atomistic, absolute, scientific kind of time, as this is necessary for measuring speed. Severini stated, "Speed has given us a new conception of space and time, and consequently of life itself." Accurate timekeeping was essential to the Milan that I showed you as the futurist depicting. Unlike the workers of agricultural Italy, for whom solar time and the seasons were still far more important than world standard time, The city dwellers of Milan were more reliant on clocks and timetables. They had set working hours in factories, Taylorism boosting their time efficiency. They were commuting in from the suburbs, probably by train, and they had free time at night illuminated by newly introduced streetlights, all of which we saw in the Futurist paintings that I showed you previously. This fact, this importance of this scientific kind of time, combined with the idea that Marinetti was thinking of Einstein's recent theories of relativity when he wrote Time and Space Digest today, and a larger issue with an idea that futurism, because of its supposed repudiation of the past, requires this very clear delineation between past, present and future, and both that point and the point about Einstein I would happily argue about. All of this has led to phenomenological and intuitive ideas about time being given a somewhat lesser role in Futurism's temporality. However, Marinetti's phrase from the birth of a futurist aesthetic, we have almost abolished the concept of space and notably diminished the concept of time. We will thus arrive at the abolition of the year, the day and the hour. This distances Futurism from world standard time and links it to the more experiential temporalities of Bergson and Husserl. The passage continues. Meteorological phenomena anticipate us because the seasons have already been fused together. Has noctambulism of work and pleasure in France, Italy and Spain not already melted together the day and night? This, as much as the concern with speed in a scientific kind of time, is evident in the same Futurist paintings I showed you earlier. And I'd now like to turn to look at Bergson and Husserl's phenomenological approaches to the present, which both drew on Augustine's idea that all temporal experience is present, as perceptions of past memories and future signs both take place in the present. Augustine said there are 3 times: a present of things past, a present of things present, and a present of things future. And what I'm really arguing here is that the surrounding environment that the Futurists were painting was temporal as well as spatial. As I'm sure you all know, Bergson was greatly revered by the Futurists. Severini was exposed to his ideas around the time of the launch of Futurism. Marinetti too was very well versed in European philosophy and used Bergson a lot when defending his preference for intuition over intellect. But Boccioni, above all, was Bergson's most dedicated Futurist follower. However, it should not be assumed that Boccioni had an exhaustive and complete knowledge of Bergson's thought. His notes from Bergson's writings probably come from Papini's 1909 anthology of Bergson translations in the Biblioteca Nazionale Bredense in Milan, and the superficiality and rapidity of Boccioni's reading of Bergson have already been noted, and I give this as a sort of caveat that if any Bergsonists in the room find my reading of Bergson a little simplistic, it's because I'm looking at him through Boccioni's eyes, as it were. Boccioni used Bergson to justify his opinions, particularly his rejection of photography. Duret, this idea from Bergson that time cannot be measured or divided, it's a flux and not static or linear, or as Bergson put it in Time and Free Will, it's essentially heterogeneous, continuous and with no analogy to number, is important for this idea that, for Boccioni, that even, I'll show you some examples of the photography I'm talking about here, this chronophotography that you get from Edward Maybridge and also Etienne Jules Marey, and also this photodynamist futurist photography by artists such as Bragaglia. Boccioni was opposing this in that it divided temporal flux. It captured a specific moment or moments rather than depicting what Boccioni felt he could do better through painting and sculpture. And he quotes Bergson when he's defending this. In Plastic Foundation of Futurist Sculpture and Painting in 1913, Boccioni quotes Bergson as saying, any division of matter into autonomous bodies with absolutely defined contours is an artificial division. any movement viewed as a transition from one state of rest to another is absolutely indivisible. This aversion to division begs the question as to how Bergson distinguished past, present and future. In Matter and Memory, he says, "What I call my present has one foot in my past and another in my future. In my past first, because the moment in which I am speaking is already far from me. In my future next, because this moment is impending over the future." This Bergsonian element in Boccioni's practice can be identified in a number of works, and I'll briefly give you two examples here. This interest in simultaneity is present in the composition and also the title of a work called Simultaneous Visions, where temporal moments, as you can see through the moving carriage in the centre of the work, and also spatial positions, it's the same figure that you see in profile and also front on there. They collide together. Also, Boccioni's Bergsonian concern for the synthesis of relative and absolute motion in the human figure is seen in the sculpture Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, in which a simultaneity of movement is captured. And this is what Boccioni was doing in response to photography as an alternative way of capturing Bergsonian flux. As I will come to briefly, Edmund Husserl's more diachronous approach to the phenomenology of time better suited this chrono and futurist photography. Now, another major caveat here, Husserl's major work on time, the Phenomenology of Internal Time Consciousness, was, although written and presented in the years preceding Futurism, the lectures were not edited into a book until 1928, and Husserlian phenomenology was not taken up by Italian philosophy journals until the 1920s. So I'm not suggesting here that this is thought that the Futurists were aware of, merely something that I find a useful alternative way of looking at the Futurist temporality. Husserl's work, like Bergson, is looking at how individuals perceive time, and he's particularly interested in the perception of sensations without stimulus, in Augustinian terms, the present of time's past and the present of time's future. When trying to describe the passage of time like Bergson, Husserl uses the example of a melody. And I quote, "When the new note sounds, the one just preceding it does not disappear without a trace. Otherwise we should be incapable of observing the relations between notes which follow one another. Nor, and I'm paraphrasing this time, do we preserve the prior notes and hear the present and past notes simultaneously, as in neither of these cases would we hear the succession, the movement of the melody." And Husserl considers our ability to do this through the ideas of memory and protension. Husserl divided memory into two parts, distinguishing retention, in which the immediate past is attached to the present by a comet's tail, from recollection, when a previous moment is actively remembered. Protension is the futural equivalent of retention, the awareness that another note is to come. Interestingly, some of Baller's most iconic works illustrate Husserl's idea quite nicely. His paintings of swifts and swallows give a sort of pictorial form to the comet's tail. The changing position of the bird's wings in flight are repeated and layered, the bodies traced along and around the canvas. The image of where the bird has been is retained and protained. To give another example, Baller's Hand of the Violinist here is very apt for this idea of melody, and there's a sense that the previous, present and forthcoming notes are all being played. In the very famous Dynamism of a Dog on a Leash, the swiftly moving legs of the dog and the owner are blurred. The body of the dog does not appear to travel, even though the legs swing furiously forwards and backwards, whereas in Girl Running on a Balcony, this clearly shows the figure travelling from left to right, and the examples I showed you earlier of chronophotography were not chosen lightly, in there's a clear interest here for Balla in this chronophotography. But to conclude, coming back to Boccioni, so Husserl's diachronic successive model of the phenomenological experience of time can also be found in Boccioni, despite the allegiance I've already claimed to Bergson. And this states of mind triptych, the title of which can in fact be related to Bergson's use of this term, shows a successive scene across 3 canvases. So here we have a painting known as the Farewells, which I compare to the present of things present, those who go, which we compare to the present of things future, and those who stay, or the present of things past. And you can just make out in this, or you may be able to, that most of the green in this area and across on the other side is actually embracing couples. And the fact that they're embracing demonstrates this protension, that they're aware of their forthcoming separation. And so with this painting, with this idea that there's a present of things future and a present of things past, comes back to this idea that the present can be futurista or passatista, and that the futurists are aligning themselves with a presentism, but very much a futurista presentism, in which their actions in the present were hopefully going to change Italy's future.